Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon. Here is the session about Azure Data Protection with Veeam. We're pretty happy to see you here. And we promise it's going to be a good and live interactive session. We've got a couple of slides to show, and then Eric is going to take away and to show the actual demo of our products, what we've got for data protection in Azure. Obviously, it is session coming from Veeam, so it's a Veeam product. Before we get started, let's go through some quick introduction points. My name is AZ. You can see my title on the left part of the screen. I'm working as a technologist in product strategy team here at Veeam, and I'm joined today by my colleague and a friend, Eric Ellenberg, who is inside system engineer for public cloud team. Eric, a couple of welcome words from you.
Yeah, thanks, AZ. Really glad to be here today. Thank you for joining us. We've got some good content for you, so stay tuned, and we'll start moving through things.
All right. So again, it is a live session. Whenever you have any question, any concern, well, anything that you want to share with us or with the whole audience, just use the Q&A panel or the chat functionality. We are going to monitor it closely, and we'll make sure that everything is going to be addressed. So with that, let's go and let's talk about things that can happen in the cloud. And one of the things that I have to talk about that. It is a data loss, and believe me or not, but this is really popular thing that can happen there. And yeah, we've conducted a couple of surveys, a couple of studies, and we've been, asking that question. So what forms of data loss have you experienced? And we've got plenty of customers, so it is a good reference base for us. So almost 40% of them reported that they have experienced some sort of a data loss related to, the human errors. And if you think about that, that makes sense because we all human after all, and we make mistakes. So it is pretty known situation when someone got deleted something that he wasn't supposed to, and then he realized that after a while, and the data was gone already. So yeah, what else? There are some other reasons, for example, related to security, related to the kind of a ransomware activities, and these days it is a really popular buzzword, if you allow me that. So you do not even have to to go through the week without noticing that there is another company exposed with the data being stolen or being compromised or being deleted, and that happened in a cloud data center, or at least in the cloud infrastructure that they manage. That could be some other things, for example, related to compliance and different abbreviations all over the world, GDPR, CCPA, you name it. But then, depending on that, someone might have lost some data, and whenever the regulations came in, so he could not provide with a copy of data, and therefore it was considered to be an incident of a data loss. So it all comes to the fact that you still need a backup, regardless of the platform that you're using, whether it's a cloud or a SaaS or physical or a virtual, it doesn't really matter. It is a good practice or kind of a best practice to have a couple of copies of the production data and being somewhere. But then if you think about that, okay, I'm using a cloud provider. Why don't they, take care of my stuff that I put in there? And then here comes the shared responsibility model for different clouds. It looks somewhat a little bit different. However, this one is for Microsoft, and it is a clear fine line between the responsibilities of what you're responsible as a customer of this cloud, and the hardware and some of the other stuff in data centers that they as a cloud provider are going to be responsible for. So whenever there is a power outage, they will fix it and they will try to replace the failed, the hard disk drive, things like that. But whenever you bring the data, you build up applications, you enable security in the cloud, it's going to be your area of responsibility, and therefore you'll need to take care of the backup thing. All right, so with that, let's talk about Veeam native cloud protection approach. And what we've got there is the multiple solutions, basically for all three major hyperscalers. We've got Veeam backup products for AWS, Azure, and GCP. And our idea is simple. So we've got offerings in the corresponding marketplaces, so people can go there, deploy our solutions, and essentially it's going to be yet another EC2 instance or virtual machine deployed in the corresponding cloud. And then you are going to access that and manage all the data protection consisting of a couple of steps. So, or a couple of layers, if you allow me. The first layer of protection would be to take the snapshot of the virtual machine and to store it along with the virtual machine. It is quick and dirty and everything, but then it would allow for the fastest recovery possible. So the second layer of protection would be to basically grab the data and put it into the object storage. In case of Azure, it would be Azure Blob, and then it would be retained there, could be archived, so you're going to pay much less comparing to snapshots. The third layer of protection would be to extract the data out of cloud and have a copy somewhere in your local data center, which would be handy for various compliance reasons. And whenever something happens within the cloud, you can easily, instantly recover the data using file level recovery wizards or converting that virtual machine on the fly. And for example, it could be now a VMware virtual machine or Hyper-V virtual machine or even Nutanix. We don't really care. What we care about is the availability of the data, the ability to recover the data whenever possible. So this is our cloud native approach, and it has been successful so far. So later we're going to show you what Veeam Backup for Azure is and how you can manage the first, the second, and the first step over here. Then for now, let's talk about the solution in a nutshell. Okay, so Veeam Backup for Azure. Right now, it get to the point that we've got version number 3. So it's been a while on the market. And what does this provide exactly? Let's talk about that for a moment. So we are really proud to present the Azure native solution, something that was developed with all the Azure considerations in mind. So we've used the Microsoft best practices, and we provide the agentless backup and disaster recovery strategies using, like I said before, native snapshots and backups and the extraction of backups. But regardless of that, it is Azure native. So works specifically for this cloud. What else? It is policy based, so we are going to have like multiple, or you can have multiple backup policies and to automate the snapshots, backup, and data lifecycle management, which is really handy because, well, some data needs more frequent backup or protection, and some data that's less frequent protection. This is fine. We also get an option to ensure the consistency of applications. For example, if you're running, I don't know, a virtual machine with a SQL installed over there, you might need to get a copy of the transaction logs, which is really possible with our solution. We're really great whenever it comes to the recovery options because we allow different recovery types, different granularity levels, regardless of this. It could be a file level recovery, Windows, Linux, doesn't really matter. It could be instant recovery using, again, using Azure functionality or migration to on-premises data center. So it's kind of a lot. how can you get this solution? This would be one of the questions that you might ask. And I already mentioned that Azure Marketplace would be a first place whenever you need this solution, something to protect your data in Azure. So you'll go into the marketplace, you will see a couple of offerings. One of them would be a free edition, another one bring your own license edition. In the free, there is no difference between them. It's only the limitation would be that free edition supports protection up to 10 virtual machines, or I believe SQL databases too. So yeah, it might be handy for the SMB or small business companies. And whenever you got Veeam Universal license, which could be the case because we know that many of our customers in the cloud, they used to have something for VMware or for Microsoft already for on-premises, and therefore they got Veeam Universal license. So you can bring this license into the cloud and use it over there, bring your own license solution, and then import the license right after the installation. Let's briefly touch Azure Backup for Veeam Backup for Azure user interface. It has a modern user interface with various tabs. One of them would be always for virtual machines, so you can configure all the policies over there and define the scope of the protection for each policy. And another one would be for Azure SQL databases. By the way, we support managed instances and SQL servers over there. So I think I've talked enough, and I'm going to hand it over to Eric. And remember, keep asking if you have any questions. We're here to answer them. So Eric, take it away.
Thanks, AZ. I appreciate you covering those points about just how Veeam's public cloud solutions work and why you need a backup in the cloud and some of the things that the public cloud solutions offer. So like AZ said, while I get switched over to my browser here, and we're going to just talk about how you would get up and running with Veeam Backup for Azure and just take you through the interface a little bit. Please feel free to ask any questions while we're on this session together today. We don't have a lot of time, but we want you to get the most out of it. And if we don't have enough time to get into some details that you need today, then we'll have an email to share with you after the demo is done, so you can contact us. Okay, so like AZ said, when we want to start protecting our Azure workloads, we can go in the Azure Marketplace, we search for Veeam, and like you said, there are 2 different editions available. So functionally the same, the only difference is the free edition, like AZ said, can only support up to 10 instances to backup. And it being a free edition, there's no production support. There's email only support for that. But basically, you choose your edition. There's a few different details that you can review on this page. There's actually some deployment guides here, so you can look up information about just the product in general. And if you just want to get started with it, you can hit Create, and this is going to create a virtual machine. So a couple things to point out about just how the product works and product architecture is this is not a hosted solution. So we don't host the backup solution. We don't host your backup data. So you are setting up a VM that's going to host our product using this image here. And then you're going to be sending your backups into a repository in an Azure Blob container that you also manage and control. So the one thing we would point out about that is just since you're in control of it, people often ask us, how do I deploy this in a really secure way to protect my backup data and my backup solution? So the main thing that we point out is that you can deploy this solution because it is agentless and cloud native into a separate subscription or into, at the very least, a dedicated resource group. And that is so you can lock down who has access to that subscription that hosts your backup solution and your backup data, or that specific resource group. So that if people are doing things in like a production resource group, like this guy over here, right, they're not affecting, or they don't have access to your resource group that holds your backup solution. So a lot of this information about deployment is covered in the user guide. So you can look up the user guide on veeam.com, and it will actually walk you through step by step. So I don't want this to be a step by step. I want us to get to the good stuff. I just want to point out, these couple of things about security. In terms of what is being deployed, it's a single virtual machine. Our minimum requirements are 2 vCPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. There are a few different VM types in Azure, depending on your region, that would have those resources or meet those requirements. So basically, as long as you choose the VM size that has enough resources for that appliance, you're good to go. All right, so once you go through the deployment, you're going to have this VM that's in your account. And we showed you a picture of the console just a couple minutes ago, but it's a completely web-based product. So all I'm going to do is go to my IP address of that appliance at HTTPS and then the IP. Of course, I have that mapped to a pretty DNS name so that we can get to this easily. And you would be logging into the Veeam Backup for Azure web console. So this is giving you an overview of what's different statuses over the past couple of days. But initially you wouldn't have anything in here. You would need to do a little configuration to get it set up. So the good thing is it's a 1, 2, 3 go type process. You're going to add your Microsoft Azure account or accounts. So this application running on this VM can talk to those Azure tenants and those subscriptions and make API calls to Azure for those subscriptions and tenants. Then there's an item here for reviewing workers, and then you add your repositories where you're actually going to be storing your Veeam image level backups. After you do that, you're ready to set up your first policy and start backing up your VMs and Azure SQL instances. So what does this look like? So we've got accounts here. We have Azure accounts and repository accounts. The one thing I'll point out here on today is Azure accounts are what you are protecting, the Azure tenants and that have resources that you want to protect. Now, your repository account is like an Azure account, and as it says here, your Azure account can also be used as a repository account. The difference is we're not backing up things that you are setting up as a repository account. This is something that you're using to send your backups into, so you can separate where your backups are from where your production data and workloads are. Okay, there are more details about this in the user guide. Of course, I'm going to try to leave some time for questions. So let me know if you have any questions about that. But adding an Azure account, super easy. We're going to say add here. And then on the next screen, we're going to say create the service account automatically. So what this is going to do is actually create an app registration in my Azure AD tenant so that this application that runs in this VM can talk to that Azure AD tenant and, again, make API calls and access the resources so we can do data protection operations. So the process looks like this. You copy your code the same way that you would be pairing up a streaming subscription with your streaming app on your device. We would enter in the code, we would log in with that code to one of these Azure tenants here, and then that would create the app registration that Veeam needs to talk to that tenant. The next step is pretty much done. You would be next, done kind of deal. All right, so that's how you get Veeam Backup for Azure connected to your Azure account. Now, workers. So AZ touched on this before with that cloud native slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what this worker thing is so that we all are clear on what Veeam means by a worker. So in an on-prem environment, you would have a backup server, and that backup server is managing the backup jobs. It's managing the different sort of configuration, the repository and retention operations. But in an on-prem environment with Veeam, the actual data mover, the actual thing that's generating that backup data and moving it somewhere else is on a proxy server. So you have to size the backup server according to your environment. You have to size the proxy server according to your environment, and that proxy just sits there and it basically processes data for that site that it is deployed to. Now in the cloud, everything that we do in the cloud comes at a cost. You only pay for what you use, but you pay for every single thing you use. So we don't want to set a proxy server out there and be doing nothing at some point. We only want to have that kind of proxy action happening when there is a need for it. So we call these workers because we spin them up when we need them to do a backup to or a restore from Azure Blob. And we deploy those workers on demand. So when we're doing a backup of an Azure VM or an Azure SQL instance in this particular region, this is where we're going to put that worker, the VNet and subnet, and it gets deployed to that place. And when its task is done, the worker's terminated. So we're trying to optimize cost as much as possible so that we can do our operations with a minimal cost impact for you. Okay, so that's what a worker is. That's what they're for, what they do, how it works. So this is just specifying your worker configuration for where they are going. Final bit of setup is your actual repositories. So I'm expanding that column here a little bit just to show you what I've got set up. I've got 3 different storage classes, 3 different repositories in each of these regions where I have workloads that I'm protecting. So if I was setting that up, super easy. I'm going to say Veeam demo repo. On the next step here, I would choose the Azure account where that holds that storage account that I'm going to use for my repository. So if I had another Azure account like that repository account to work with, I could just choose it from the drop-down. Then I would choose the storage account that's within that Azure tenant. This gives me my list of storage accounts here. Let's say I was just picking this one in West Europe. Okay, now which container in that storage account are we going to use? So Veeam Backup for Azure uses Azure Blob as our repository, the storage that backs our repository. So I don't have a container in there, but I would create a container in that storage account and then select my folder. So let me actually pick another storage account real quick, just to show you. Okay, so here's a container that's in that storage account. And then I could say use an existing folder or create a new folder. So if I created a new folder, we'd call this demo backups in this case. And then if I want to specify the storage class for this repository that I'm adding to Veeam, I could say I want this to be a hot repository or a cool or an archive. Or I want to infer the storage class of this repository from the storage account itself. Now the other option here is kind of the easy button, which is what I did to create those 3 repositories that I have, which is auto create all the tiers. So this will create a hot, cool, and an archive tier within this container within that storage account. And that basically gives you access to store those backups, especially long-term at a really big cost savings compared to like the regular platform native tools. Okay, encryption settings here for the backup data that's being created and stored in that repository. We can use password-based encryption. You can see my password manager is trying to help me create that password. And then, once you specify the password, that's what's used to encrypt the data. Now, if you don't want to specify like that password, just to Veeam, if you'd rather use a key that you already have in your Azure Key Vault, we can actually use that key to also encrypt the data. Okay, so that kind of finishes the discussion about configuration, because at that point you would have connected Veeam Backup for Azure to your Azure account. We would have reviewed that worker configuration. Even if you don't specify any settings there, if we need to do a backup in a region, we will actually create that VNet and the settings we need to deploy the worker to that region to create the backup. And then adding your repositories. So From kind of start to finish here, we can be deploying this VM in about 5 minutes. We can go through this configuration in about 10 to 15 more minutes. So you've got a working backup solution in 15 to 20 minutes. So it's super easy to get up and running with it. So we encourage you to check it out, after the session today. All right, now we'd be then ready to create our first policy, and I'm just going to walk us through a policy real quick and the different recovery options that we have. So I've got a couple different tabs here, virtual machines and Azure SQL. And if I open up this particular tab with Azure VMs, so this is going to be a policy that's going to protect Azure VMs. So I'm going to give the policy a name, a description, and then I would choose my source. Where is that data I want to protect? So I'd choose my Azure tenant that I'm connecting to. I would select the regions that I want to protect workloads in. All right, let's say it was those two regions. And then I can choose what I want to protect in those two regions in that Azure tenant. So I could select, individual systems, or I could select everything in a particular subscription, everything in a particular resource group. And by everything, I mean Azure VMs, because we are creating an Azure VM backup policy, or any Azure VM that's in those regions with a specific tag that you choose. So it doesn't have to be named Veeam Backup. It can be any tag that you're already using in your organization. We're just using this Veeam Backup tag as a demonstration. But this would basically tell Veeam for Azure, I want you to scan these two regions in that tenant for any VMs with this tag every time this policy runs and back it up according to this policy. So it's a tag-based selection. Then we have some guest processing options for enabling application-aware snapshots for Windows instances. We can do scripting for Linux and Windows. This is particularly handy for Linux. It doesn't really have a VSS type subsystem for disks, so we would probably want to run a script before a snapshot to pause or stop a process and then start that process again after that snapshot's completed, so we get an application consistent state. Then we have targets. So we can add some tags to the snapshots that Veeam creates as part of this policy, and we have flipped this little toggle here to enable backups. Then on our scheduling step, this is actually when we're setting up when we want Veeam to run this policy and what types of backup data you want it to create and how long and how many of those backup restore points do you want Veeam to keep. So this is super easy. We're going to see that we have a daily schedule. This is when we're setting Veeam to create the different restore points. So let's say that I was doing something like every 4 hours, let's create a snapshot, bingo, and then maybe twice a day I'm creating a backup. All right, great. So we're going to keep a certain number of the snapshots. I'm going to keep a week's worth in this case, and then I'm going to keep the backups for a certain amount of time. So let's keep the backups for a month. Cool. Now I'm going to put the backups in hot because if I'm doing a restore, I'm very likely going to be working with data that was a matter of days old, and I don't want to pay Azure for accessing or using that data. So I'm going to put it in the hot repository. All right, now I want you to watch up here in the top when I hit apply for these settings. This is going to actually query the Azure rate card API, get a list of prices, and then compare some metrics of those VMs that are contained in this policy, and basically compute some math for us. So we don't want you to save a backup policy that meets all of your different business requirements for RPO or RTO, and then it winds up costing you way beyond what you expected to every month for your storage costs and for your platform costs, okay? So this cost estimation tool is giving you some idea of what could this policy cost from an Azure perspective in terms of storage, for snapshots and backups, even API calls on a monthly basis. For how much would that cost from Azure. Okay, then I'd be ready basically to save my policy. I would set up some auto retries here. I would say I want someone to get a notification on failure or a warning, and then I'd be ready to save the policy. Okay, now restore options here. So when I'm protecting data, or when I've got policies protecting data and I want to do a restore, I'm going to go to protected data tab and then select what I want to restore and how I want to restore it. So if I want to do a VM restore, like give me the whole VM from this point in time, okay, select the VM or VMs that you want to restore, select the restore point that you want to use. Let's pick one of those restore points. And then I can say, do I want to restore it to the same account? Do I want to restore it to a different account? Do I want to restore it to a different subscription? You have complete flexibility over where you want to put that restored workload. So let's say I'm going to put it in a different region. Okay. So I kind of step through this process, and everything is wizard driven. You don't have to be an Azure guru to get this. You just pick what properties you want that restored VM to have. Let's say I want it to be a D series over there. I want it to be in a different resource group. Let's rename it to restore, and you can kind of get the idea where I'm going with this. Then I'm just picking this in the web console, what properties I want that VM to have, what virtual network I want it to be attached to. All right. So that is, I don't have any VNets over there. So that's kind of what a VM restore looks like. Now we also support Azure SQL with Veeam Backup for Azure. So once you set up your SQL policy, the restore process is restoring a database. That's the way that we can do full database restores in Azure without using an agent. Because in this case, this is really a platform as a service. We don't have an underlying VM that we have access to. So we're going to use the Azure APIs to issue our backup calls basically to that database instance, and then we can restore that database instance from a given point in time to the same server or to a different server. Finally, you can also do file level recoveries. This is nice because we spin up that worker instance like I mentioned before. That worker instance is going to attach to this restore point that I select here, and it would give me a web console when that session is ready, where I could pick and choose the files that I want from that restore point and in a web console view of my file system. So it's a super easy way to get files restored from that instance. Okay, so that kind of covers everything that Veeam Backup for Azure does. I know I ran through a lot of stuff really quickly. I hope we're asking some questions. If not, there is a contact point we will share with you in just a moment. The last thing I want to touch on and show you today is, what can this do in terms of the Veeam platform? Because Veeam is a lot more than just one product or a couple of products. It's a whole platform, a whole portfolio of products. So if you do have things on-prem that you're protecting with Veeam, and now you're moving things into Azure, and you want to have Veeam protecting those things in Azure, then you can connect this appliance to your Veeam backup and replication server. So you can see here that the licensing for this appliance is actually managed by this VBR server, which I have over here. So I've got now my VBR server. I'm running the latest version 11, with even the latest cumulative update. So I have VBR connected to that Azure appliance. I can see from my VBR console those different Azure backup policies that I have configured in that appliance. So I can easily see and manage those policies from my VBR console. And you can see I also have my AWS backup policies and my Google Cloud backup policy. So I can manage and control all those different backup policies. And if I had on-prem backup jobs in this console, I could see those and manage them here as well. So once I've got VBR connected to those appliances, and I have it connected to those appliances repositories where they are storing data, I can do some other interesting things. So I can copy the backup data that Veeam is creating out of those providers, out of those clouds, and I can put it somewhere else that VBR has access to. Because when Veeam creates that backup data, not only is it less cost because we're putting into object storage, it also gives us the ability to use it outside of that cloud. So I can copy the backup data to a different platform. I can also say, we're evaluating, a different platform. So let's move this particular Azure VM back home to my vSphere environment, or let me restore this Azure VM to a different platform entirely. So there's a lot of different options here for what you can do with that backup data once Veeam has created it and put it in that repository. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to AZ to wrap us up. I appreciate your time today, and we'll answer any questions we may have time for. So AZ, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eric. That was a nice demo, and you really covered everything that I hoped you would cover. We had some questions, but I managed to answer all of them already. So yeah, thank you guys for being so active and being so interactive with us. With that, let's go to check the ongoing promo that we've got, because it is always a good thing to talk to the vendor and see if they have something
Oops.
exclusive for you. Yeah, you're right. So here is one link which you can follow. Despite its name, AWS, it's also can provide you the credits for Azure. So we give it away and then provide the some of the unlimited coverage for you within a month. So yeah, pretty good offer. If you ask me, feel free to check it out and get some Azure credits for free. With that, yeah, it's time to end this up. And I really enjoyed this session. Thank you so much for staying with us. We wish you to have a good day. And if you have any questions, just go to veeam.com. Thank you so much.